Hi, this is Matt. Have you ever wanted to create a flow that could monitor something in Office 365, like a Azure Active Directory group, and then do something whenever that thing changed? Well, what I want to do in this video is show you one technique that you can use using the graph delta query. It's a little tricky, but if you hang with me, I think you'll figure it out. So this is a 3-part video series, and it is accompanied by a 3-part blog post series. So each of these videos will follow along with each of those articles. So you can actually see me doing the work inside of Azure and Flow. In this first section, we're going to create the Azure app and then consent that app. And that app is going to be our bridge into the Microsoft Graph. And then we'll discuss the plan for how we're going to move forward once we have that part built. And that'll lead us into parts 2 and 3. So hang with me. Let's see how this goes. All right. To start things off, we have to begin by creating an app in Azure. So I'm inside my Azure portal, and right up here under search, I'm going to search for app. And that'll bring up app registrations. Don't go to enterprise applications. What we're looking for is app registrations. And it'll take us to this screen. Once you're here, you're simply going to create a new application registration, and it'll bring up this create blade. Inside the create blade, let's give our app a name. I'm going to call this one Flow Delta Query Video, because I'm creating a video of it. And I'm going to leave this as Web API, Web App API. The sign-on URL really doesn't matter, but just take note of what you type in here because you're going to need it just momentarily when we do the consent. So here I'm going to go HTTPS localhost, and then I'll give it something random like flow delta query. In the same time that I'm doing this, I'm keeping track of a few of these items in Notepad. Okay, so once I have that done, I'm going to click Create. And Azure is going to create kind of this shell of an application. And the important things here are we're going to need this application ID a little bit later. And they make it really easy inside of Azure. You just click here to copy that. And so we'll throw that into our notes as well. Now, we have to apply some permissions to this. We have to grant this app access to the Microsoft Graph. So I'm going to click on Settings, and in Settings, I'm going to come down to Required Permissions, and it's going to ask me about the APIs that I want to use. So I click Add, I select an API, and it gives us a couple different options. I'm going to choose Microsoft Graph and choose Select, and then down under Select Permissions, since in this case, for my scenario, I want access to the users and the groups that contain them, I'm going to choose Read All Users Full Profile, and then I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to find Read All Groups. Now, if you have an idea for how to use this and you want to use different permissions, then you'll need to come in here and set those permissions for your specific purpose. But for us, those two will do just fine. So I choose Select and I choose Done. Now what I notice is that it says my application permissions are 2 for the Microsoft Graph. So that's just a little confirmation that we checked 2 checkboxes. Now the next thing I need to do is I need to supply a password or a key that I'll be using throughout my demo. trust me, after I'm done with this video, I'm going to delete this key and use a different one. So don't try to sneak in and get into my tenant this way. So in this case, you just give it a name. I'm going to call this one Microsoft Flow. And then I can set a duration. 1 year, 2 year, never expires. That's entirely up to you. For us, let's choose never expires. Now notice that there's nothing here in the value field. That's because it's going to be populated when I click save. And it will disappear after I close this blade. So we have to copy this back into our notes. And then we can close the blade. And just to show you, when I go back into keys, you'll notice it has my key, the Microsoft Flow key, but it's hidden. If you need to get rid of this key and start over again, like I'm going to do very shortly, I choose delete. That key is no longer possible to be used against this app. All right. So we've created our app, and now what we need to do is we need to tell the app that we're going to authenticate it, or we're going to authorize it so that it can be used against the graph. In order to do that, I need to get the tenant ID for my Azure Active Directory instance. So I go to Azure Active Directory, I go down here to Properties, and right here, my directory ID, it's the same as my tenant ID. So this is my tenant. And now I have all the information I need to be able to authorize my app. At this point, it's probably helpful if you open the first blog post in this series. So if you go to my website, ableblue.com, and you click on blog, it'll take you down here, and you can find the Microsoft Graph Delta Query from Microsoft Flow document, part 1. In this, I also have all of the text that you'll need to be able to manage this entire post. So here I have the text that I want to copy and paste in for my consent. What you want to do is replace the tenant ID with the tenant ID that we copied from Azure Active Directory. And then you want to copy the app ID from your notes and the app that you just created. Finally, you want to copy the URL that we used as the redirect URL, or that home page parameter from our app that we created in Azure Active Directory. Once you have all of that, paste that into a browser window and hit enter. Now, it's important to note before I do this that I'm in the same browser instance that I logged in to Azure Active Directory. That's important because as soon as I hit enter, it's going to ask me to log in. If this account is not the same as the account that you used in Azure, you may get an error because this account should be a global administrator. Now we'll notice right here that we have the consent that or the permissions that we requested, and I'm going to choose accept. This is going to redirect to that bogus URL, and that's not a bad thing. It just means that we went to the URL that we anticipated, which of course goes nowhere. So we've made it through and we've got our consent. So the next thing we can do is go into Azure and go into our enterprise applications. And what we should see here is the Flow Delta Query video that I created. If I open out that app and I go into Properties, I can see the same information from when I created it. If I go into Permissions, this is where I'll see the Microsoft Graph permissions that we requested earlier. So all of this is set up, and now we're in a really good position to get going with our flow. So what we are planning to do here is we're going to create some workflow variables, and then we're going to read from a configuration list. And if that list has the Delta link in it, then we're going to execute the Delta link. If it doesn't, then we're going to perform an initial query. So here, we're going to call the graph for an auth token. And when we get to that point, I want to talk about the security around what we're doing, because there are some new techniques coming out that I'll hopefully be able to create a video for shortly. Anyway, if we have a Delta query, then we'll call the Delta query. If we don't, then we'll call the initial query, which once it's done, will return to us the Delta query. So essentially, this side of the equation, or this side of the flow, is the initialization, and this side of the flow is pretty much every call after that. And then essentially all we do is run through a loop where we're processing users, calling the graph, processing users, calling the graph, until the graph returns empty, at which time it will return to us a Delta link, and we'll store that and wait for our next run. That's essentially all we really have to do in this process. And we'll do all of that in parts 2 and 3. But for now, we're going to go ahead and provision our SharePoint lists to set us up for our process. So I'm going to create a new list in SharePoint. This is just called Flow Group Configuration. And then once we've done that, we'll create another list called Flow Groups that's going to store our output, because this isn't really about what to do with the users, it's about how to get the users. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is go into our SharePoint site and do all of that. All right, we're on our SharePoint site where we're choosing to store our information. And I already have 2 of these lists set up because this is what I used for creating the blog post. But essentially all you have to do if you're new to SharePoint is click on Site Contents, click on New List, and call this Flow Groups Configuration, and I'll append video to each of these. And then I'm going to create another one called Flow Groups Video for storing the output of the users. In the Flow Groups configuration, add a column, make it multiple lines of text, and call it value. And then create a new item in here called Delta Link. And so now you're all set. You have the Delta Link value set up in the Flow Groups configuration list. And what we're going to do in our flow is we're going to ask for this value. And if it's blank, we're going to run the initial steps. And if it's not blank, then we're going to run the Delta query, which is what that value is going to be. So join us for part 2, and we will set up and move forward with creating the flow that calls the Delta Link query.